Hello, I'm Randall Pinkston, and welcome to Ethics Matter, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. Our guest today is Dr. Scott Sagan. He is the Caroline S.G. Monroe Professor in the Department of Political Science and a Senior Fellow, Center for International Security and Cooperation, Freeman Spokely Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. Welcome.
Thank you.
Dr. Sagan, you're the author of several books, articles on nuclear weapons. I think your resume runs about 9 pages, I counted them. And you focus on issues such as targeting, deterrence, and the ethics of using nuclear weapons. Now, in recent months, maybe even in recent years, we've heard a lot about presidential executive orders. Well, today, our audience is going to be introduced to a presidential directive that I suspect not a lot of Americans know about. The presidential guidance on the employment of nuclear weapons. We'll get to that in a moment. But first, let's talk about your most recent work. You are one of the co-authors of Ethics, Technology, and War, and the Nuclear Necessity Principle, making U.S. targeting policy conform with the ethics and laws of war. Now, both of those articles, as you know, since you wrote them, appear in the fall issue of Daedalus, the quarterly publication of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Now, the bottom line, you say, there's a difference between how America talks about nuclear deterrence and how it's practiced. So let's explore that perspective, beginning with one of your quotes. You write, "Technological innovations and political developments are changing the nature of warfare, posing complex challenges to traditional standards, which fall under the influence of international law and the just war doctrine." Before we talk about the innovation and the changes, would you just please review for those of us who maybe never learned it or forgot, exactly what is the just war doctrine? And would you talk about those 3 components, those 3 main components of just war?
Just war doctrine is a set of philosophical principles that most states, not all, but most states aspire to. Just war doctrine traditionally is divided into these 3 areas: use ad bellum, which is the justice of going to war, for example, only in self-defense or in perhaps preemption if it is done as anticipatory self-defense against an enemy who is about to attack you and you have no other alternative. Then there's jus in bello, justice of the fighting itself. What are the laws of armed conflict? Once you're actually in a conflict, what do you have to do? And those principles would include this non-combatant immunity principle, the principle of distinction. You have to distinguish between military targets and civilian targets, principles of proportionality, and there's a third one here, which is often called risk acceptance or feasible precaution. Michael Walzer, who's really the dean of just war doctrine in his book, Just and Unjust Wars, gives an example of a young soldier in the First World War who hears activity going on in a cellar of a house that he's passing by in what had just been a German-occupied village. And his instinct originally was to pull out a hand grenade and toss it in, because this might be a German sniper coming out to kill him. But instead, he opens the door and shouts out, "I've got guns on this building, come out with your hands up." Now, he took some risk upon himself, and it turns out that they were just civilians down there. What Walzer says is that proportionality and the principle of non-combatant immunity are not enough. We also want our soldiers to do something active to try to protect civilians, to take even some risk to themselves, to show some restraint in their actions, even at some risk to themselves. And so those would be the 3 main components, I would say, of jus in bello.
Let's talk about that presidential directive dealing with nuclear weapons. In 2013, former President Obama, well, he was president at the time, he issued new guidance for the employment of nuclear weapons that directly correlated with a key component of the just war doctrine in the law of armed conflict. Now, let me quote you the operative phrase from the president's statement. Mr. Obama said, "All U.S. nuclear plans must apply the principles of distinction and proportionality and seek to minimize collateral damage to civil populations and civilian objects. Now, you and your co-author, Jeffrey Lewis, argue that President Obama's doctrine should result in a new doctrine, which you call the nuclear necessity principle. What is that? How would it work?
Let me take you back a little bit to the beginning to help understand how there's been a tradition in the United States, in my judgment, of obfuscating, of using euphemisms about nuclear weapons. Harry Truman, when he announced the dropping of the bomb, said it was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base, so that we could avoid as much as possible non-combatants. He later, when he realized what this meant and the destruction involved, privately said that he didn't want to drop the third bomb that he could have because he didn't want to kill all those women and children. So Harry Truman understood what nuclear weapons can do if they're dropped on a city. Hiroshima did have a military industry along the edge of it, but actually we moved the target from the industrial site to the center of the town so that it would kill more people. So we were deliberately trying to kill lots of people to shock the Japanese government into surrendering. Right?
Did President Truman know about the moving of the target?
No. But he knew that Hiroshima, along with a number of other cities, had been left unscathed by the U.S. conventional bombing attack, precisely because we wanted to blow it up in as dramatic a way as possible once we got the bomb, so that that could compel the Japanese government into surrendering.
Now, isn't there a line of philosophical thought that says that kind of use of a weapon in a war is appropriate if it's going to force the civilians into putting pressure on their government to lay down their arms?
There are people who argue that, and certainly it is a, I think, reasonable argument to make about threatening to do things that you would not necessarily want to do. I think we would not want to kill lots of innocent civilians today under any circumstances, certainly not deliberately. And we have signed agreements that said the principles of distinction, that we do not deliberately target non-combatants. What Obama did by signing that executive order on the employment of nuclear weapons was to tell the military that even with nuclear weapons, I want you to follow the principles of non-combatant immunity. Do not aim deliberately at civilian structures. Now, back on this point that we sometimes use euphemisms, we've had a tradition in the United States that goes back a long ways of saying we don't target populations per se. That was a Nixon administration era statement. But under that doctrine, what we were doing as the guidance was to tell, for the sake of deterrence, this is during the Soviet Union, during the Cold War period, for the sake of deterrence, the military was told that you're supposed to target the ability of the Soviet Union to recover from a nuclear war. Because if they can't recover, that's going to make sure that they don't start it. And so that was the logic of it. But in doing that,
and that meant we were going to target their fertilizer plants and food bins and...
We're doing all those kinds of things. We had this huge number of weapons and a huge number of targets. And we were doing studies to say, well, how quickly could they recover? We claimed that we weren't targeting civilians per se, but our policy, in terms of the way it was being implemented, was to starve them to death. And to me, that's the same thing. That shouldn't be considered to be an ethical way of targeting. So what Obama is saying, here's the president who really cares about just war doctrine, who uses the Nobel Peace Prize speech not to just talk about peace, but also to talk about just war, that there's evil in the world, he says. There are times where we have to go to war to combat that evil, to respond to that evil, and we will follow the principles of just war doctrine. So now he's putting his money where his mouth is by having the policy really ingrained not just in the laws of armed conflict, which the military is now trained to understand, but also with our nuclear weapons policy. And what Jeffrey and I are trying to do here is to say, is it enough to say, well, we will not deliberately target civilians? And is it enough to say we will use the principles of proportionality? shouldn't we also say we should not use nuclear weapons against any target in which a nuclear weapon isn't necessary to destroy that target? Because otherwise you could say, well, we want to target that plant or that military base. If it's absolutely necessary for its destruction to use a nuclear weapon, then you have to calculate whether it's proportional. But if you could use a conventional weapon for the same purpose, and it would be roughly equivalent, why would you want to use the nuclear weapon at all? So there have been some who have responded to this saying this is just common sense. Of course we should do it and add that. There are others who say no, because this would weaken deterrence. Because we want the collateral damage that could come from a nuclear attack against a legitimate target, the collateral damage of civilians nearby. We want that for the sake of deterrence.
You want to put the fear of a nuclear weapon in the enemy.
But if you're using collateral damage for deterrence purposes, it's no longer collateral. It's now part of your purpose. So that's where I think the debate is today. And I think it's an important one.
You also talk in your article about the decisions that military commanders have to make to comply with the rules that are established for the employment of nuclear weapons.
Right.
And you say that it's difficult for them to know exactly what to do because they're dealing with civilians who have vague and sometimes not too logically thought out goals to employ a military tactic, a weapon, and the commanders have. So how does that work in your necessity doctrine? What's the military commander who gets the order? What are they supposed to do?
Well, my view would be that the war plan should be designed with that principle in mind, so that if there are still targets that require a nuclear weapon for their destruction, the weapons are limited to those, rather than saying we're going to have a large-scale first use or second use. And that the military commanders, following those rules, should have far fewer weapons would be necessary, nuclear weapons would be necessary, far more conventional weapons would be necessary under that principle. Now, there may be some critics who would say, by making war less costly, you're making it more likely. And I think we have to accept that criticism. That is, by saying we're going to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. national policy, it might make it more tempting for someone to use conventional weapons. But I would rather have that temptation than to have the temptation of using nuclear weapons when you don't need them.
You say that U.S. military officers want to follow the laws of war, seeking to be just warriors and not illegal killers, but they are in a nearly impossible position because of the expanded definition of military objects, the creation of loopholes, the exceptions rules, and any of those, or in a combination of those, could produce, you say, tens of millions of non-combatant deaths.
Yes.
Tens of millions.
Yes, these are huge weapons, and if you're having 1,000 of them go off in Russia or in China, there could be tens of millions of deaths. And I don't want the U.S. military to ever have to do that. But we have loosened the rules. In laws of armed conflict, as in all laws, you have two different kinds of rules. One you can call rules, one you can call standards. Rules are rules that are more tight. They say, for example, if you're driving, that you can't drive above 65 miles an hour.
That's a rule.
That's a rule. A standard is, I'm going to give you a standard that you have to interpret. Like, don't drive recklessly. That's a standard. Most of what we call the laws of armed conflict are standards. They require interpretation on the part of an officer. And I would like to see some of those standards tightened up, become more like rules. And the example that's very relevant here is the question of what is a military target, what is a civilian target? Following the laws of armed conflict, the lawyers, civilian and military in the Pentagon, have rules that they say, they've written these out and they're not classified, that as an officer you can only target a military target. However, if you see a civilian target that you believe could be used in the future for military purposes, we will deem that to be a legitimate military target. And the example that they give is a civilian airport. So in my judgment, that's too loose of a rule. That's a very loose standard. You should make it a more tightened rule.
Well, tell me this. You just mentioned the civilian and the military planners in the Pentagon. What is the role of civilians in establishing targets, in deciding the tonnage, the throw weight of a... What is the role of civilians versus military? Who controls our nuclear arsenal? I guess that's really what I'm asking.
Well, I think there's been a sea change in the degree of control on the part of civilians. During the Cold War, when I worked inside the Pentagon, civilians had relatively loose control. The president would give a 2-page guidance, and it would go to the Secretary of Defense, who would then add a little more guidance language, and then it would go to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff would add more, and they would go to the Strategic Air Command. And you would go from a 2-page document to a massive war plan. It took lots of interpretation, and the civilians were often cut out of the loop.
Did it ever go back to the president for final sign-off?
It went back to the president for a briefing, but it was a briefing without a whole lot of detail and without a lot of staff
To explain it.
To explain and to go over, this is why this and this. So you had times where we were literally attacking Moscow with 70, 80 weapons. And so it got pretty crazy because the military was doing what they're really good at, which is following the procedures that they have, and you have to have high damage expectancy against this target, against that target. We don't know the conditions, whether we'll be shooting first or second, so therefore you want to put more weapons on in case the ones you were going to have weren't launched, and it got out of control. So in the Reagan and then Bush 1, George H.W. Bush, there was, I think, a really important effort for civilians to take better control over this. And with a cooperative Strategic Air Command, later the Strategic Command, they got so that they're actually now much more integrated, so civilians know more and are following things more. That doesn't mean that necessarily you have to agree with everything that the civilians are doing, but it's no longer, in my judgment, a runaway military, a military that doesn't have sufficient guidance. It has the guidance. The question is, what should that guidance be?
Didn't you write that, I think it was General LeMay, at one point said, there are no innocent civilians? Was it General LeMay who said that?
Correct.
And so I'm wondering, so that's a mindset of a military person, of someone who is a warrior.
I think that's the mindset of a military person from 1945. It's not the mindset of a military officer today.
Okay, all right. That's my question.
I think American military officers get it now. They want to be warriors, not to be murderers. They know that they're innocent people, and they know that they're not just, their job is not just to protect American innocent people, but to protect innocent people in foreign countries, even civilians who may support their government that's fighting against us. But I'm worried about the American public and their responses in this area. Every August, there is a poll that takes place that is trying to gauge the American public's support or lack thereof for what happened in August 1945. Were we correct? Did Truman do the right thing? And that poll shows that since its height in 1945 at 85%, public support for using the bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki is now down to 45%. When I see that data, many scholars and pundits have said that this means that the public has a nuclear taboo, that we're not willing to use nuclear weapons. Looking at that, my co-author, Ben Valentino, a professor at Dartmouth, and I noticed that you can't really tell from that data whether the public's changed their views about nuclear weapons or whether they just have changed their views about Japan. Because maybe it's just hard to imagine using nuclear weapons against our friends, the Japanese. Moreover, none of those questions have ever put the audience, the participants in the study, into the situation that we were at in 1945, where we felt we had, at least, to choose between an invasion, killing lots of Americans, versus dropping the bomb to try to shock the Japanese government into surrender. So what Professor Valentino and I did was create a survey experiment, taking a representative sample of the American public, having them read a story that replicates in a reasonable fashion, or to a reasonable degree, the conditions of 1945 today. And we call this paper, which is coming out in International Security, Revisiting Hiroshima in Iran.
In Iran.
The story that everyone reads, saying this is a fictional story, but we want to get you to read it and contemplate what you think we should do, is that Iran is accused by the United States of violating the Iran agreement, the nuclear deal. And we put sanctions back on. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, in retaliation for the sanctions, attacks and sinks a U.S. ship, killing 2,406 people. And the president and Congress declare war. The president calls for unconditional surrender. And after the initial fighting begins, he's told that you have two options. You can either drop a nuclear bomb on the second largest city of Iran, and we think that that will end the war, or you could invade and march up to Tehran, and we will lose 20,000 troops if we march to Tehran. We'll still win. And then the respondents are asked to say, which of these options would you prefer? And regardless of what you preferred, if the president chose the nuclear option, would you
support it?
Support it. Would you approve of it? And what we show, and then with this experiment side, these are survey experiments. We ask the same exact situation, except you vary one thing. So like a real experiment, you can actually see how that one additional thing changes people's views. So we have one condition where 20,000 Americans die, or 100,000, like Hiroshima, Iranians. And it's deliberately designed to drop on a city. We have a second in which 2 million Iranians are killed. Still 20,000 Americans versus 2 million. And one where we say we're going to drop conventional weapons on the city and 100,000 will die. And what we find is that rather than having the below 50%, the 45% who say, yeah, it was the right thing to do against Japan, we now get 60% of the public saying we should drop the bomb, we would approve of dropping the bomb on Iran. And if you increase it to 2 million, you still get 60% of the public saying we should drop the bomb on Iran. And if you say, well, we're not going to drop the nuclear bomb, but we'll kill 100,000 people deliberately with conventional weapons, we get 67% of the public supporting that. So we find this to be really shocking and disappointing, because these are not collateral damage attacks, these are deliberate attacks. These are violations of the laws of war. It's a violation of our own principles. And yet the public, when it comes to revenge,
proportionality is out the window.
Absolutely.
Distinction is out the window.
And that is wrong, but that is what we're finding. So this is a really disturbing piece of research that suggests that we have a lot more to do to try to inculcate these principles. Now, I used to teach just war doctrine and laws of armed conflict. I say we should look at these laws and do they comport with your moral compass, with your moral intuition? And that's how we would try to discuss them. I now feel, however, that we need the laws of armed conflict because they counter some of our moral intuitions, because our moral intuitions aren't very moral sometimes. They're filled with notions of retribution and revenge.
They are emotional responses.
That's right.
They are responses to fear.
In one of our experiments, we asked people to describe why they chose what they did. And we found a slight increase in the number of people who made comments about Iranians being animalistic, not being human. The more people you killed in an experiment, the more you made comments like that. The Iranians deserved it, they deserved to die. And so what we suggest is that what people sometimes do is not assign the culpability of a target based on what the target's done, but how much they need to justify it because of what evil we've done to them.
To sum up our discussion today, you say that when it comes to the employment of nuclear weapons, the rules as they now stand the principles of distinction and proportionality, they are not sufficient to deal with the legal and ethical challenges posed by nuclear weapons. That America and our nuclear allies need to change their thinking about nuclear weapons, to reduce reliance on them, and to only use them when it's absolutely necessary because nothing else will work.
That is what I believe. I think that we need to have a much more open, transparent debate about these weapons in a world in which we have adversaries who have nuclear weapons and where the proliferation of weapons to other states is a very serious problem. I don't see an easy way to get rid of nuclear weapons. I do think, however, that the United States could have fewer of them and needs to think really long and hard about what are the purposes that these weapons might still hold. And I think those purposes should not be the deliberate killing of civilians under any circumstances. And I also think that we could reduce the numbers that we need for legitimate deterrence purposes by having a much more conventional weapon orientation to our war plans. Most of our war plans are like that. I think the Strategic Command's war plans should be increased in terms of their conventional quality rather than the nuclear quality.
Dr. Scott Sagan, thank you for joining us on Ethics Matter.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.